Richard was formerly the Deputy Director of the Center for Prehistory and Paleontology in Nairobi, and since 1968, he's been the Director of the National Museums of Kenya. As many of you probably know, his father passed away this past fall. However, Richard's been carrying on the work of his father. He has organized and led several expeditions into the field in search of man's past in the remote regions of East Africa. He began in 1963 and 64 with an expedition to the region along the western shores of Lake Natron. In 1966, he led an expedition to Lake Baringo. In 1967, to the Omo River Valley on the northern edge of Lake Rudolph. And in 1968, he led an expedition to the Badlands area along the eastern shores of Lake Rudolph. He's published extensively in professional as well as lay journals on the results of these expeditions, and is today considered by his peers as one of the outstanding young paleoanthropologists in the world. The East Rudolph area, where Mr. Leakey is presently carrying on research, has become the most important Plio-Pleistocene hominid locality to date, yielding over 90 hominid specimens, as well as stone tools, which have been dated at 2.6 million years. These, thus far, the oldest. The expedition to East Rudolph is unique. Richard Leakey has organized the largest expedition ever in search of man's ancestry. It includes an interdisciplinary consortium of anthropologists, archaeologists, human anatomists, paleontologists, geologists, and geophysicists from Kenya, Great Britain, and America. He's a pioneer in this respect, and this innovation of his has paid off. There have been some outstanding discoveries that have been made in Kenya, discoveries which may alter the ideas regarding the evolution of man. But without further ado, I present my good friend and colleague, Mr. Richard Leakey, who will discuss the nature of the East Rudolph expedition and the discoveries that have been made there thus far and their significance. Richard?
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a very great pleasure to be here this evening, to be present in such a magnificent auditorium. I've been to the state of Iowa a number of different times over the past 4 years, and it was only last night in the city of Iowa that I made the remark that I found it difficult to believe that corn could possibly grow in a state that never has sunshine. At the time, we had been debating whether it would be possible to travel from the place I was at to Waterloo by plane, and the odds were against such an occasion. Being an eternal optimist, I said, in the morning, the sun will shine, and it did. Thank you. I had little to do with it. But I am delighted to have seen this state in the sunshine, and it is indeed a remarkably different place when you can see what you're driving through. It's a very great pleasure to come to Ames, to this university, particularly in view of the contributions that a number of people from this university have made to the research in Kenya. In the film that I will narrate, I will be able to introduce some of these visually, but because the film is comparatively short, one cannot attempt to cover all aspects and all the personalities. I'd like to pay particular tribute to Dr. Carl Vondra, who has been in charge of the geological program thus far. The work, as he mentioned, is the work of a multidisciplinary group of men and women, scientists from several different nations, and my position is one of a coordinator and sometime leader. The results, some of which are without question very dramatic and very significant, have been made by men and women, many of whom are not present in the United States and who perhaps will never travel to these distant lands. However, these people must get full credit for their work. Many of the important fossils of early man have been recovered by a small group of Kenyans who have received no formal education, Kenyans who have only been to primary and part-time secondary schooling. Yet these people have a tremendous knowledge of comparative anatomy and comparative osteology. Without question, these represent one of the more skilled groups of fossil hunters available in the world. It is a great pity that they could not come to see the interest and concern that the people of the United States have for the work that they are involved with. Some of these people we will introduce. I'd also like to make quite clear that my own position is one of somewhat of an amateur. I have never had a formal training in physical anthropology, or indeed any formal training involving a university background. Just to digress for a moment, and it might amuse some of you, particularly the people in the audience who are of my own generation, at the time I was a teenager, my parents offered me the opportunity to go on to high school, to college, and to university. At that time, I had spent the first part of my life sitting at excavations in the hot sun, and I was totally convinced that I was far too clever and far too wise to waste my time sitting in the sun looking for old bits of bone. So I decided not to go on to college and instead went into business, tried to make some money by showing people around East Africa. After doing this for 2 or 3 years, I became very bored with the business of showing people around East Africa and decided that I would go and take up anthropology. To do this, I needed an academic training, or so I thought at that time. So I flew to London and took a train up to the University of Cambridge, one of the more important universities in Great Britain, and a university that my grandfather and my father after him had attended in their work. I eventually obtained an appointment with the top man, a very serious English gentleman who had not the slightest element of a sense of humor. After getting into his office, he looked up at me over his spectacles and he said, "What did you want to see me about?" So I said very rapidly, very nervously, "I wanted to join, sir, join your university." He said, "On what basis do you think you're entitled to join our university?" I said, "Well, my grandfather and my father were here, did good work, and I would like to do good work as well, and I'm told I need a university education." He said, "On what basis do you think you're entitled to join our university?" Again, and I thought he hadn't heard me. So he knocked the desk and he said, "Educational qualifications." I said, "Well, I don't think that would help if I mentioned those, but I can fly an aeroplane, I can drive a jeep, and I can show you around East Africa if you ever care to visit." Showed me the door, and I left. My pride was sorely hurt, and it only recovered about a month ago when I was again in Great Britain and went up to Cambridge to address an open inter-university lecture. On this occasion, this same gentleman had the questionable good fortune of introducing me. Which was extremely good for me, and at that time he did say if I was still considering joining Cambridge, the situation would now be slightly different. However, I have no intentions of going to Cambridge at this time. In case there's anyone from Cambridge, I won't say any more. The reason we went to Lake Rudolph in 1968 was primarily because I wanted to do field work. I wanted to organize and operate an expedition of my own. In 1967, I had been part of an international effort working in southwest Ethiopia, an expedition involving a team from the United States under Professor Clark Hull, a team from France under Professor Arenburg, and a team from Ethiopia and Kenya that I was leading. The area that we were working turned out to be much smaller than we had anticipated, and it became clear that there was not sufficient space for all of us to participate adequately. There was a helicopter in 1967 that was part of the Omo expedition, and I took this helicopter south along the northeast side of Lake Rudolph in search for better hunting grounds. Shortly after we left the Omo, the pilot and I spotted an area about half the size of this great hall where there appeared to be a sedimentary structure that might possibly have fossils in it. We settled the helicopter, we got out. Right where we settled, we found some fragments of bone together with a few small artifacts. Amongst these fragments of bone was a single tooth of a pig. If you have any training in African paleontology, you will bear with me when I say pig teeth can be very meaningful and can give you some indication of the paleontological period that you are dealing with. This tooth, which may or may not have been associated with those artifacts, gave me a great deal of happiness. It appeared that we had found a site where there were artifacts earlier than the earliest found at the Olduvai Gorge. Got back in the helicopter, flew back to the Omo, told Professor Howell and Professor Arenburg that the Kenya part of the expedition would not be returning in 1968. Later that year, I flew to the National Geographic offices in Washington and presented 2 stone artifacts and 1 pig tooth and said, "This is evidence of the greatest site yet found." I don't think they fully believed me, but they did give me a small grant to go back and work that site. In my excitement, I had totally forgotten to mark on a map where we had been in that helicopter. And thus far, we have yet to locate that site. That is, I'm afraid, a true story, and it's a clear indication of what one should not do in this business. However, in the course of looking for that site, we have done 2 things. We have ascertained that the site is not in Kenya, and we have ascertained that in Kenya there is without question one of the largest Plio-Pleistocene fossil sites thus far known. I'd like to now touch briefly on the subject of early man. It is important to take this opportunity to highlight some of the work that has been done, particularly as this will enable you to grasp the significance of some of our discoveries. In 1924, the first physical evidence of early man was recovered from Africa. This consisted of a skull, or partial skull, and a lower jaw of an infant, a child at the time of death, and this child's skull was used to coin or define the term Australopithecus. Between 1924 and 1959, all of the major discoveries in Africa were made in South Africa. Amongst these various fossils, there was Australopithecus africanus, the small type of Australopithecine, Australopithecus robustus, a larger type, and a third type, less common, called Telanthropus or Homo erectus. It is widely held that Australopithecus africanus is the ancestor not only to ourselves, but to all forms of early man that came thereafter. Australopithecus africanus has a brain size of less than 500 cubic centimeters. If you are going to talk about the evolution of man and the development of man through time, it is imperative that you not only have physical evidence of man, but in addition, you have evidence of how long ago these various specimens lived. Thus far, we have no firm evidence of dates for any of the South African fossils. Despite this, all of the textbooks will demonstrate the development of man along different patterns using the fossils from South Africa. I think the time has come in this study to say quite clearly that we must now no longer use the South African collection, which lacks chronological data, but rather use the collection from Eastern Africa, where all of the fossils can be related to geophysically dated strata. Let us now turn to East Africa. In 1959, the first skull of early man was found in East Africa. This was a skull discovered by my mother in the lower part of the Olduvai Gorge succession, a skull dated at 1.75 million years, and a skull at that time given the name Zinjanthropus. Zinjanthropus has subsequently been renamed and is now considered as another example of Australopithecus. Between 1959 and the present time, Olduvai has produced a wealth of information, and in addition, other sites have been worked as well. At Olduvai, there are two basic types of man recognized in the early succession: Australopithecus boisei, or Zinjanthropus, a second type, Homo habilis, the handyman, who is thought to have been the maker and user of the many stone implements found at that site. The stone implements and the fossils of man at Olduvai do not go back beyond 1.8 million years, because the strata stop at that point and the lower levels are not exposed. The Omo expedition was designed to locate additional material. The East Rudolf expedition was conceived of with the same basic intent. The Rudolf expedition consists of men and women of different disciplines operating for the same purpose, that is, pursuit of knowledge in search of the truth about man's origin. I think at that juncture it would be appropriate to move ahead now. The film that I'm going to narrate does not deal solely with bones and stones. I have found from several experiences that one cannot keep anthropologists concentrating for more than 10 minutes on bones and stones. A general audience such as this is usually of a much broader mind and can be kept going longer. But I wouldn't attempt to keep you going a period as long as the 45 to 48 minutes that this film runs for. So if we could have the house lights down, I hope you'll run the film at the sound speed. The film was made with a view to a presentation that will be made on the 29th of March to the National Geographic Society. This is a lecture that I will present, and thus far the Society has not seen this film. The film was edited in Kenya and was shot in Kenya, the photography being done by Bob Campbell, a very close personal friend of mine who has worked with me since 1963. Today, on the eastern side of Lake Rudolf, you find a number of different species living. There are two basic ecosystems, one immediately adjoining the lake shore and a second inland. The inland animals are animals that have adapted to a way of life ideally suited to a desert. They do not require water except on the odd occasion. Near the lake shore, you find two principal species of land mammal: the common zebra, Burchell zebra, and the topi antelope, which you see here, an antelope that is usually associated with a lush, wet savanna. We know from the fossil record that this area supported many other different species in times past. Today, there are no people living here, yet we know that people did live here even comparatively recently. The people who lived here left only 15 years ago. They left in search of better pastures because 15 years ago, as a result of overgrazing, the area would no longer support them. Kenya is a small part of Eastern Africa. The African continent is immense. Our fossil sites are merely small spots within Kenya, and even smaller spots within East Africa, which is an area dotted with lakes to the west in the western branch of the Rift Valley, to the east in the eastern branch of the Rift Valley, with Lake Rudolf lying at the northern end of the Kenya segment of this Rift Valley. At the south end of Lake Rudolf, there is evidence of recent volcanic activity. This volcanic activity has been a feature of this part of Africa for many millions of years, and this volcanic activity through time is important. It has produced material that enables us to date the sedimentary structures in the area where we are locating fossils. This area along the lake shore is an area that does today, as I mentioned, support only topi and zebra. Yet it was along this area that the tribe that have now left did live. The tribe that lived here is a tribe known today as the Gabra. They moved about 100 to 150 miles northeast of Lake Rudolph, and the purpose of the move was to find better grazing. They failed in that purpose and today find themselves still in the desert. One of the reasons that we know that they lived here is that they left behind traces of their occupation in and around the shores of East Lake Rudolph. Piles of stone representing structures of one kind or another. Some of these structures, places where they kept young domestic animals. Other structures, structures of houses. The point is that all that remains today is structures that are durable, structures made of stone. Yet when we look at the Gabra, these people who lived here so recently, we know that their way of life is complicated. Their equipment is varied. The diversity in their character and their custom is extremely rich. The archaeologist is only dealing with those things that were left behind that are preserved. The anthropologist deals with much more. In the case of the Gabra, you find today that they live in these simple, movable, temporary villages. Structures made of stick with cloth and grass mats providing the roof. The grass mats are made usually by the women, and once a grass mat is weathered and no longer waterproof, it is discarded. Items such as grass mats and sticks and cloth would not be preserved in the fossil record had they ever been used. I am sure that early man would have used things such as grass and sticks and reeds, but we have no evidence of this use. The desert in North Kenya is a harsh environment. Man can and has adapted to living there. In addition, the animals that he herds, the camels and cattle as well, can cope with this harsh situation. Normally, cattle require water every day. Cattle in this desert can go 2 to 3 days without water, being driven in long distances to the 1 or 2 isolated water holes that occur in North Kenya. This particular water hole is one of 3 that this particular section of the Gabra tribe utilize, and it is a well that takes 13 men to get to the bottom of. The men come in early in the morning and go down the well and have this human bucket system, pouring water into one single trough, 4 feet in length, and from this trough, all of the people who come here and all of the domestic animals quench their thirst. We have ascertained that as many as 500 camels and over 1,000 cattle, plus people, will drink from this single source during the course of a day. When the water is finished, as every day it must, those that have not drunk wait until the next day. The social organization and much of the character of the tribe is based around this exploitation of this very valuable resource. In addition to those characteristics, there is another tribe that also utilizes this waterhole, another example of the adaptability of man. 2 tribes, normally distinct and separate with territorial characteristics, are prepared to break down territorial boundaries in order to survive. Man is territorial, but man can break down territorial boundaries, and the fact that man can is, I think, one of the most important features about man to be used to guide mankind into the future. We do not need to fight about territory. We can discuss territory to our own mutual advantage. In 1969 and in 1970, we utilized camels for our preliminary exploration of the Lake Rudolph area. We had no roads into much of the area at that time, and we found the camel to be an exceedingly useful animal in that it could go across country for long distances without water. All of the books will tell you that a camel is a herbivore. We found from experience that indeed he does eat grass and leaves, but his temperament and his teeth are such that he would make a first-rate carnivore. The camel will devote a great deal of his waking hours to planning how and when he can get a good bite of human flesh. It was a constant worry, and one was constantly on the alert, so much so that once we had done the initial survey, we moved on or progressed to mechanized transport. Mechanized transport has the disadvantage in that when it dies, you cannot eat it. Whether we made progress or didn't remains to be seen. The camels are certainly a characteristic of the Gabbro, and when the Gabbro lived on the eastern side of Lake Rudolf, no other tribe would dare to have ventured in. Today, the immediate water's edge is rich with bird life, rich with fish life, and we can see many species of birds, such as these pelicans, different species of stork, other forms of wading birds, spoonbills, herons, and so on and so forth. Within a 3-mile radius of our base camp, in any day you can go out and count over 150 different species of birds. A tremendous wealth of birds are dependent upon this simple, small, narrow eco-niche. We know from the fossil record that birds such as the pelican and the stork also occurred here 1, 2, and 3 million years ago. We also know that in the old Lake Rudolf, from the fossil record, we had examples of reptiles, such as crocodile. Today there is only one species of crocodile, but we know 2 million years ago there were at least 3 quite distinct species. 2 became extinct, 1 species remains, not only in Lake Rudolf, but indeed over most of Africa. Why did certain species become extinct? These are the questions that still have to be answered as a result of continuing research. The topi on the lake shore are typically antelope or antelopine in their behavior, and it is common to find males carrying out mock battles and generally jousting and pushing for this territorial drive. The pushing and jousting is usually ignored by the rest of the group, who concern themselves more with feeding and the very business of existence. This territoriality, this dominance or apparent dominance and predominance of the male of the species is not something only confined to the topi. The majority of species of antelope in Africa are territorial in character. Man is claimed to have been territorial, and indeed man is territorial. But the question is, need man any longer be as territorial as sometimes he appears to be? When the Gabbro moved out, because the environment was too harsh, there was a period during which the vegetation recovered. Once it had recovered, there was again opportunity for man to move back. In this instance, it was not the Gabbro who came back, but it was another tribe. This other tribe was a tribe that is traditionally resident in southwest Ethiopia. The tribe is known as the Shangila. The Shangila do not herd camels generally, but rather large herds of sheep and goats with a few cattle. The sheep and goats have caused tremendous damage to Africa. In my opinion, there is no other single factor that has done more damage to the environment of Central and North Africa. At Rudolf, we have seen the damage that the goats and sheep can inflict in a very short space of time. They will move in and totally remove the surface cover of grass. They will strip the leaves off the small bushes, and in a matter of days, an area that was green and quite comfortable is reduced to wind-blown sand, such as this. This situation not only damages the vegetation, but also the herds of sheep and goats will be herded across areas where there are fossils lying on the surface. We have found fossils badly broken and damaged by the passage of hooves of sheep and goats. This problem was brought to the attention of the Kenya government, and it was only this late last year and early this year that the matter was resolved. The area has now been declared a national park, and the sheep and goats will be excluded, thus providing protection for the wildlife and for the prehistory that is so unique to this part of Kenya. As I mentioned, in addition to the sheep and goats, the Shangila do herd some cattle. Generally, except in the times of very wet weather when there's been plenty of rainfall, the cattle are herded along the water's edge. There are not unlimited herds of cattle, just a few, and these spend most of their time actually in the water, feeding from the grass and the reed. We have seen often cattle almost out of their depth, grazing and surviving by this means. Again, an instance of adaptation. The Shangila, being a basically poor tribe, cannot possibly all the people own property, such as domestic animals, and they have developed a very strange custom. Part of the tribe becomes cast-outs or throw-outs, and this part of the tribe has become a subgroup within the tribe and goes by the name of the Shangila Molo. Part of the tribe becomes cast-outs or throw-outs, and this part of the tribe has become a subgroup within the tribe and goes by the name of the Shangila Molo. The Shangila Molo are groups of young boys, young men, middle-aged men and old men, never any women, and the Shangila Molo devote their entire lives to this type of existence, moving their way up and down the northeast side of Lake Rudolph in search of food. Much of the time they spend fishing. Part of the time they will also hunt the occasional zebra, the occasional topi antelope, and if possible, the odd crocodile and the odd hippo. They have no permanent villages, they have no permanent structures, indeed they have very little material wealth. They own the canoes, which are hollowed out tree trunks. They own the fishing equipment, basically harpoons and long lengths of twine, and they own, at least some of them own, loincloths to adorn their bodies with. A very poor people, a very simple people, yet a very complex people who have adapted magnificently to this way of life. The purpose of showing you the Shangila Molo is merely to indicate the diversity and the adaptability of man. Man can survive this way, he can survive in the city of Nairobi, he can survive in the city of Los Angeles, he can survive orbiting the earth. Really a remarkable species. Normally the fish are obtained, one throw in 5 or 6 will produce a fish. Fish range in size from that one of about a pound to sometimes in excess of 200 pounds. 2 years ago I was in a canoe such as this. When the harpoon was thrown, the line went taut. Thereafter, the canoe shot forward at a tremendous rate. I was certain that the man had speared a hippo, and I was extremely unhappy. As it turned out, the canoe did slow down and stopped, and it was a fish that we subsequently weighed at 285 pounds. This particular catfish is a most common species of fish in this area and provides a staple to these people. When sufficient fish have been obtained for a meal for the day, the group will go back to the shore, wherever they happen to be, and get busy with the process of the next stage of their occupation. Different members of the group will busy themselves with different responsibilities. Some will light a fire, such as you see here. 2 sticks of different hardnesses are rubbed together across a notch to produce an ember which falls into a dry bed, in this case of dried antelope dung, which provides sufficient heat and fire to start a fire going for cooking. Others will busy themselves with the preparation of the fish for cooking. Others will repair the fishing equipment. Some members of the group will do nothing. They will sit or lie asleep, waiting for everything to be done for them. Again, although these people are living on the east side of Lake Rudolph, they show a basic similarity with all examples of Homo sapiens. This is the distribution of labor and the corporate organization for survival. This is a key aspect of man and is an aspect that must eventually be incorporated in our definition of man. The archaeologist and the paleoanthropologist must, if he can, document wherever possible evidence that will show this type of behavior, because it is this type of behavior, over and beyond the simple manufacture and use of stone tools, that shows the presence of man. The fish is cooked in either earthenware pots or, in some instances today, aluminum pots. Some fish is sort of char-broiled on the charcoal. The shells of turtles are used for bowls. Some wood is used for things like pillows and harpoon heads. Bone is used for harpoon heads. And in some instances, mild steel has been obtained and is fashioned again into harpoon heads. The introduction of mild steel is comparatively recent, but is very effective and widely used. We also know that these people, the Shangila Molo, will use stone. It was only last year, when members of the expedition had driven out to examine the remains of a topi antelope that had been killed in the night by lions. Some of the antelope remained, and I believe our group were contemplating taking some of the meat back to the expedition. They had no means with them of cutting up the meat, and 3 Shangila Molo came up, obviously had the same idea. They too had no equipment, but one of them wandered off, picked up 2 stones, used one to knock flakes off the other, and used this crude chopping tool to skin out and hack off meat which they took away with them. The most disastrous result of that whole thing, over and above the loss of meat to the camp, was that the members of the expedition were so astonished that not one thought to photograph the process. You can see here that in the process of eating this type of food, a great deal will remain. Only the meat is eaten, and in things such as the skull of catfish and the limb bones of antelope, the debris or the refuse will consist of bone. This bone is just dumped either there where you're sitting or just over your shoulder. As a result, if this group of people live here for 2 or 3 days, there will be quite a concentration of bone refuse accumulating. Turtles, tortoises, crocodiles, fish, antelope, and in some instances, hippo. This will be evidence of a campsite. Sometimes these people will build simple structures. Usually these structures are developed at the heat of the day to provide shade. Generally, the shade is provided by taking the poles with which the canoes are pushed and pushing these poles into the soft ground, then using the shafts of the harpoons to provide cross members, and on top of this is placed grass. If the ground is too hard, they will take stones and pile these around the base of the upright posts, thus providing the necessary support. If and when they leave, they will take their poles with them, but the piles of stone will remain. It is evidence such as that, piles of stone, that archaeologists will find in the prehistoric record. Things such as grass and sticks are seldom preserved. Similarly, here you see the distribution of labor. The young people cut the grass. The older people place the grass on the roof. Why there should be this distribution is really not important. The fact is that in man there is always this distribution of responsibility and sharing of labor effort. It is conceivable that early man too built structures such as this. Certainly at Olduvai Gorge, down at 1.8 million years, there is evidence of a simple stone structure, a place where, as far as we can ascertain, piles of stone were piled up around the base of uprights to provide support for a structure perhaps not unlike the structure that is being built here by the Shangila Molo. Well, as I mentioned, these Shangila are moving up and down constantly in search of food. Campsites such as this may serve the group for a week, a day, or a month. They move on, and when they move on, what they leave behind is usually the garbage. As Glyn Isaac, the co-leader of the expedition, rightly pointed out, the archaeologist is entirely dependent upon the garbage of man. Here you see some garbage, piles of stone, and bone left behind at a Shangila Molo camp. You have the remains of prey animals: fish, tortoises, zebra, antelope, hippo, and crocodile. Bones accumulating here over different periods of occupation, and in some instances, and at this particular site, there is also evidence of man himself. The Shangila Molo do not bury their dead, and when a member of the group dies, the group will move on, abandoning the corpse at the campsite. The corpse will usually be torn apart by scavengers, and different parts of the body will be widely scattered. But one does find evidence of human remains at these campsites. In addition to the campsites, the lake shore provides opportunity for complete skeletons of animals to be buried in the soft silt and clay. As the lake rises, much of this shoreline area is temporarily submerged. Because of the sediment carried in the water, because of the saturation of the soft silts and sands, much of this bone will gradually become embedded. Once embedded, the conditions for fossilization are ideal, and the process gets underway. It is this cycle of events along the immediate lake shore that has provided us with so much data at Lake Rudolph. These specimens that you're seeing here are fossils, fossils formed pretty much in the way that fossils are still being formed today at East Rudolph. At East Rudolph, we have this opportunity of studying the present and relating the present to the past. In a sense, this is quite unique and very, very important. The area consists of some 900 square miles of heavily dissected badlands, sediments that accumulated in the area from about 4.5 million years ago right through until a little less than 1 million years ago. Thus far, we have only done a preliminary reconnaissance of the area. Our base camp is situated at a place called Kubi Fora, which is in the middle of the paleontological region. Ilaret and Alia Bay are two names of places to the north and south. The pink shaded area that doesn't really show there represents the distribution of the earliest range of sediments, the yellow the next oldest, and the blue the youngest. I say again, stretching in time from about 4.5 million to a little less than 1. This area is dissected, as you see here, and it is across this area that the East Rudolph expedition is today active. Because of my responsibility as an administrator of the National Museum of Kenya, a government institution, I do not have nearly as much time in the field as I would like. During the months of June, July, August, and September, I usually work a week in the city at the museum, followed by 4 or 5 days in the field, after which I go back down to the city. I fly up to our base camp at Kubi Fora, a sandy peninsula that juts out into the lake. At our base camp, we have a series of huts. We also have a boat that we use for bringing in supplies from the western side of the lake, where communications are easier, and we have a small airfield for the expedition aircraft that I pilot myself. The airfield is not an airfield in the sense of the word that is used in the United States. It is about 380 yards of fairly smooth ground upon which I can settle the 6-seater airplane. The advantage of this airfield is that it is so small that very few other pilots will venture in. We thus can be very selective as to who visits us and when. This is important because we are the only habitation and can provide the only facilities, and if we were not to limit visitors, you can be sure that we'd have so many that virtually no work would ever get done. My wife, Meave, spends June, July, August and September as much as possible in the field. When I first met her, she was completing her doctorate dissertation in which she was studying the anatomy of the limb bones of modern African monkeys. We discussed things several times, during which time I prevailed upon her to look upon fossil monkeys as a far more valid area of study. We got married fairly soon after she was convinced, and today she has become one of the leading people in the study of African fossil primates. In addition to the study of primates, she is involved with the study of fossil carnivores, and on the expedition she has responsibility in helping with the logistics and with helping with the general organization of the expedition activities. The aircraft, coming up once a week on an average, or once a 2 weeks, cannot possibly bring sufficient in the way of fresh food. We truck food in on a once-a-month basis, but we also use the lake as another source of fresh food. We do not fish in the way the Shangila Molo fish, but we fish with a seine net, and with 3 or 4 hauls, we can usually catch 30 or 40 fish, quite sufficient to feed the large number of men and women on the expedition. Last year, we had over 22 scientists and 40 other people during the peak of the season. This fish, known as the tilapia, is a very good table fish, and it's particularly good during the first 2 or 3 weeks of the expedition. We eat fish every second day, and we eat fish for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. One of the intriguing things is that people from Europe do not mind fish for breakfast, but generally colleagues from the United States find fish at breakfast more than once a month rather difficult. It is a strange thing how this should have developed, and I've never seen fish so abused. Treacle and syrup and all the sweetening things you can imagine poured. The base camp consists of a series of huts with the major area, feeding area, living area, as you see there. In this main area, we feed and we have 2 laboratories, but the base camp is not used all the time. Members of the expedition usually live out in the field, coming back to base only once every 10 days or so to replenish, to rest, and to participate in discussions on what has taken place, what is to take place, and to meet with visitors. This gives me an opportunity to introduce some of the people in the expedition. I cannot possibly introduce everybody because there are far too many for a film of this nature. The expedition has 2 basic co-leaders, one Glyn Isaac, who you meet here. Glyn is based at the University of California, Berkeley, and in addition to his co-leader responsibility, he is involved with the direction of the archaeological research. Here you see him busy on the excavation of an artifact, one of the largest stone choppers recovered from this particular site, a site from which we have recovered many artifacts associated with the broken remains of animals, dated at 2.6 million years. Kamoya Kemeo is a Kenyan. He has worked with me since 1963, and he is the other co-leader and assists greatly with the logistics and administration of the expedition. In addition, Kamoya is in charge of the team of Kenyans that have found most of the hominid remains. Kamoya probably has more discoveries to his credit than any other man alive. John Harris is a paleontologist. He is from Britain and presently works at the National Museum, and he is concerned not with fossil man, but with other species, such as the many antelope, the elephant, the hippo, and other forms as well. John started with us in 1968 and has worked generally each season in the field. Ian Finlater, who you see here, is a geologist from the United Kingdom, and Ian's work is not so much the general geology but rather specific aspects of the geology in which he traces and records the distribution of different periods of volcanic activity. His concern is the mapping of volcanic ash strata, such as these, generally called tuffs, and from these tuffs he obtains samples that can be used for dating by the potassium-argon method. The potassium-argon dating is done not in Kenya, but in Cambridge, England, where there are two members of the team, Jack Miller and Frank Fitch, perhaps two of the leading people. We can supplement our dating work by another method known as the paleomagnetic chronology system. This involves analysis of remnant magnetism in the laboratory and is done by Kenyans in the university at Nairobi. Bruce Bowen is very much a local man. He's sitting in the audience. He's from this university, and it was Bruce who was introduced to us by Carl Vondra, and it was Bruce who has undertaken so much of the major geological work, preparing a detailed map of the entire area. At the time Bruce began, we had no map of this region. Bruce has worked during 1970, 71, and 72, and we now have a very clear understanding of what occurred in terms of geological history. Gary Johnson was a member of this a student at this university, got his doctorate here under Carl Vondra, and is now at Dartmouth. Gary is concerned today with a more specific aspect of the geological program, and he is doing microstratigraphic work. At this particular moment, he is seen working in an area near the base camp where he was mapping out the geography of the region following specific horizons in the sediments, particularly shorelines. If we know the distribution of the shoreline, we can predict with a fair degree of accuracy where it is likely that the best concentrations of well-preserved fossils will be located. This type of work will now be continued by Gary and others. This microstratigraphic analysis of the geology will go on for a good many years to come. I would anticipate a minimum of 10 years before this second phase can possibly be concluded. Another member of the expedition involved with geology is a young lady by the name of Kay Berensmeyer. Kay Berensmeyer was the first geologist to go to East Rudolph, and she came up with us in 1969 at a time when the area was basically unknown and when there was a great deal of skepticism about the potential of this region. Kay, in a sense, pioneered the geological work, and in addition, she is today concentrating on some specific problems relating fossils to environments of deposition. This, in a sense, is a continuation of a pioneer study with some very, very exciting results apparently coming forth. In addition to that aspect of the work, Kay is also perhaps best remembered for the fact that in 1969, even though she was a geologist, she observed evidence of archaeological activity. At this particular site, which now bears her name, she spotted some flakes of stone which she took to be artifacts. A subsequent excavation proved that the artifacts were coming from this deposit, a deposit of ash, and the ash has been dated at 2.6 million years. The site is known as KBS, or the Kay Berensmeyer site, and the ash is known as the KBS tuff. Imagine having a volcanic ash named after you. We honor all our people in different ways. This particular site represents one of the earliest evidences of hominid activity. We have tools associated with the broken remains of different prey animals, a clear indication that man was coming back to a home base and presumably operating on a cooperative basis. That same horizon, the KBS tuff or KBS ash, has a number of sites in it, but unfortunately very few of these localities have thus far been excavated. Much of our time, or much of Glenn Isaac's time and his team's time, has been devoted to exploration. One other site has been excavated at that horizon, known as the Hippo site, and here you see one of the people involved, John Onyango, a Kenyan with a heavy beard. And this Kenyan is a graduate student at Berkeley and will hopefully in the near future, complete his doctorate dissertation and come back to Kenya to take up a senior position jointly at the National Museum and at the university. The method of excavation at these sites is not dissimilar to the method of archaeological excavation anywhere in the world. The objective is to recover as much data as is humanly possible. Small half-meter grids are carefully worked, and all of the excavated soil is passed through a very fine screen so that even the smallest pieces of stone and bone will be recovered and documented as material from a particular known area. Jack Harris is from New Zealand. Jack is an archaeology student, a graduate yet again at Berkeley, working under Glyn Isaac. Jack's interest is not so much with the early material, but with material that is slightly later in age. At this time, as far as we can ascertain, these artifacts that he's seen here examining date from deposits that are about 1.4 to 1.5 million years. As such, they are of the greatest importance. They relate well in time to artifacts known from elsewhere, such as Olduvai, and they give us additional evidence of the development of human technology in sites other than the Olduvai Gorge. The story of the development of stone implements is not as simple as some of the books would have us believe. It is, in fact, quite complex, but only when we have additional sites will the full degree of complexity finally emerge. Well, in addition to archaeology in the field, there's archaeology in the museum. All of these artifacts have to be carefully measured, carefully drawn, and carefully accessioned in the museum collections, and all of this material is permanently housed at the National Museum in Nairobi. We also have excavations that deal with fossil bone. Here you see Dr. Paul Abel, who is an organic chemist who has a tendency towards paleontology, busy on the excavation of what turned out to be a complete skeleton of a fossil elephant. When we first found this elephant, there were only a few parts showing, and we thought it would be a comparatively easy operation. Paul, assisted by Kelly Stewart and a number of others, spent 6 weeks exposing what turned out to be a complete skeleton, so complete that it was clear it could never be stored in the National Museum of Nairobi. We don't have space for specimens of that magnitude. So instead, we will construct a museum over the elephant in the field. This means that visitors to the area can go to the Elephant Museum, and elephant scientists who want to look at it can go there too. Smaller fossils, such as this skull of a rhino, lower jaw of a rhino, complete skulls of crocodiles, long since extinct, such as this, skulls of hippo, skulls of horses, skulls of carnivores, skulls of a variety of different species of pigs, are typical in our paleontological collection. For the first time, we are recovering many species hitherto only known on the basis of fragments, represented by complete skulls and complete skeletons. Some of these are quite new to science. One such completely new specimen was the skull of an ancestral giraffe, here being examined by Bob Campbell, the photographer. Bob found the skull of the giraffe, and today it bears his name, Scythotherium campbellensis. Here you see the typical way in which fossils are located. Members of the search team working slowly and carefully across the Badland country, examining every single scrap of fossil bone that their eyes see on the ground. It is in this way that important finds are made. Once made, the fragments are collected, taken back to the field camp, carefully wrapped, and taken to the base camp. It was Bernard Ngenyeo, a Kenyan, who found the major find. There is Bernard, there is Kamoya, two principal members of our recovery team. In July of last year, Bernard was working up a rocky gully or creek when he spotted, eroding out from the side, a number of fragments of bone which, upon examination at this site, turned out to be fragments of a cranium that was undoubtedly and indisputably a cranium of early man. At the time, I was not present. The site was shown to Kamoya, who immediately recognized its significance and brought in all of the members of the field team to get busy on the recovery operation. The recovery operation requires the careful screening of the top 6 inches of soil, followed by careful excavation. Thus far, 2 months of work have been done at the site, and there is a great deal more work to be done, and I anticipate this year at least a further 2 months. The fragments were small. The 2 largest fragments were found right at the beginning and were sufficient to indicate the importance of this find. There you see Harrison Mutua and Kamoya examining the 2 largest pieces of the skull. Not particularly large, but the curvature on those pieces and the character of those pieces is sufficient to indicate to Kamoya and later to me that here was something very different. It was not until later that we realized how different it was. But it did appear that by careful work we might recover all of the pieces. The screening recovers fragments sometimes no larger than a grain of rice. Usually the pieces about the size of a thumbnail. All of these pieces have to be put back together. All of the screened material going through the dry screen is then taken to the lake and carefully washed in the water. This pile of debris on the side of the screen that you see there will all go this year in sacks down to the water's edge, and some 90 tons of dirt will be carefully washed in the hopes that a few other pieces of bone the size of a thumbnail might be recovered. The reason we want to recover it all is the skull is still not entirely complete. Once sufficient pieces had been recovered, after the first 2 or 3 days of operation, it became clear that the process of reconstruction could get underway. As a leader of the expedition, I wanted to be right in the midst of the most exciting part. Bernard Wood, an anatomist from London, part of the team, joined me, and in those first few days, we worked like beavers to try and get the skull together. This type of work